Everybody seeing that okay? Okay, fantastic. I think I have this timed right about at a half hour, but I know my coworker Christy will have no problem getting the big cane and yanking me off stage if I happen to go far, but I think we should be in good shape. I'm really thrilled to be able to talk to you all today about Hayes. So I'm going to give you just a general historical overview of his life, his presidency, his political career, his war career, and we'll learn about Lucy, of course, the First Lady as well. Advance my slide, if it will let me. All right, so Rutherford Burchard Hayes was born in Delaware, Ohio on October 4th, 1822. He was the son of Rutherford Jr. and Sophia Burchard Hayes, who had relocated from Dummerston, Vermont in 1817. Rutherford's great-grandfather, Ezekiel Hayes, was born in Connecticut, worked in Brantford and New Haven as a blacksmith, and he served in the War for Independence. 2.5 months before the future president's birth, Rutherford Jr. died of typhus, leaving his expectant wife with 2 young children, Lorenzo and Fanny Arabella. Lorenzo would die at the age of 9 while he was skating. He actually fell through the ice and drowned, leaving only Fanny and Rutherford, who was quite sickly when he was born, actually, so much so that his mother did not know if he would survive past early childhood. Sophia's brother, Sardis Burchard, who had come from Vermont with his sister and brother-in-law, had an immense paternal influence on the children and served essentially as their surrogate father. Sardis left the Hayes household in 1826 to strike out on his own, and he ended up in Lower Sandusky, today Fremont, Ohio, where he set up a general store and became one of the most successful merchants in the state, netting around $10,000 or about $350,000 in 2026 dollars. Though Sophia supplied the basic essentials of her son's early education by teaching him to read, write, and spell, Sardis was really integral in seeing young Rutherford through his formal schooling, first to the Norwalk Seminary in Norwalk, Ohio, and then to Isaac Webb's Maple Grove Academy in Middletown, Connecticut, and later to Kenyon College. While at Kenyon, Hayes became interested in politics and enthusiastically engaged in political debates. He also developed an interest in pursuing a legal career, and after graduating from Kenyon as a valedictorian in 1842, Hayes enrolled at the Dane Law School of Harvard University in the fall of 1843. Hayes studied with the distinguished jurists Simon Greenleaf and Joseph Story, among others. He was admitted to the bar at Marietta, Ohio, and established a law practice in Lower Sandusky. In 1842, benevolent Uncle Sardis also purchased the land that would become Spiegel Grove and built the initial part of the country mansion that is known today as the Hayes home for his nephew to use as a summer retreat. So what we're looking at here is the left or southern, I should say, aspect of the Hayes home. We're going to see a slide of it later. On the right-hand side, there's another whole section that mirrors it that's added on in 80 and 81 when Rutherford and Lucy are in the White House and know they're going to want to have a larger home when they retire. So we'll see that here shortly. Hayes grew up in Delaware in a 2-story brick house around the corner from his birthplace. This birthplace site now today has a BP gas station on the site of it. I've gotten gas there. Rudd, or Ruddy, as the family called him, was close with his sister. Fanny Arabella Hayes, married name is Platt, so Fanny Arabella Hayes Platt was her brother's intellectual equal, but she was not able to go to college like him because of restrictions of women at the time, though she did receive an education at the Putnam Female Seminary. In 1856, when Fanny was 36, she gave birth to stillborn baby girls, and she died a month later from complications. And Rutherford was devastated by this loss, writing, "My great friend from childhood is gone." Hayes found practicing law in Lower Sandusky difficult. Although his uncle was always in need of legal counsel, Rutherford was not able to secure enough work to keep busy. He formed a partnership with Ralph Buckland, a prominent attorney in town, but even with this partner, he could not reconcile practicing law in the city with his ambition. There was great excitement at the time as the U.S. began its war with Mexico, and Hayes thought the soldierly life would be a good strengthening aspect for him to strengthen his constitution, so he traveled to Cincinnati in the hopes of securing an appointment as an officer. On his way, he stopped in Delaware to visit his mother and sister, and during this brief sojourn, he happened upon Lucy Ware Webb, who would become his wife. When he first met her on the campus of Ohio Wesleyan University in 1847, Rutherford was 24 and Lucy was only 15. And he wrote that she was a bright, sunny-hearted little girl who was too young to fall in love with, so I didn't. In Cincinnati, local physicians advised Hayes not to go to Mexico for health reasons. He had this issue with a chronic bleeding throat. And he returned to Lower Sandusky, but several subsequent trips prompted Hayes to consider moving to Cincinnati, then the West's largest and most active city, where the prospects seem really bright for a promising young lawyer on the make. Before leaving Lower Sandusky, however, he played an important role in its name being changed to Fremont in honor of John C. Fremont, who would become the 1856 Republican candidate for president. Hayes arrived in Cincinnati in December 1849 and rented an office. He spent his early years there building his law practice and appearing at social functions and making new friends. He also attended meetings of the Sons of Temperance and became involved with the Cincinnati Literary Club, which was an all-male club, which is still exclusively all-male today, believe it or not. Almost immediately after setting up his practice, Rutherford began to call on Lucy Webb. The daughter of Maria Cook and Dr. James Webb, Lucy was born August 28, 1831 in Chillicothe, Ohio. She was a devout and unusually well-educated young lady for her day. She was permitted to take classes at Ohio Wesleyan College in Delaware before enrolling at the Wesleyan Female College in Cincinnati, from which she graduated in June of 1850. She would, in fact, become the first lady to hold a college degree in liberal arts. After a courtship of 2 years, Rutherford and Lucy married on December 30th, 1852. Funny story, Lucy said that she really liked this picture of she and Rutherford, she said, because it thought it looked like he was really proud of her. All right, so continuing on. Well, I was mentioning the house here. Here you see it in its full aspect as it looks today if you come and visit us at the Hayes. So the Hayes home is part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. It's a group of more than 600 sites across the United States that connect in some way to the Underground Railroad. And the home was not an actual stop, was not an actual stop on the Underground Railroad. Rather, it has been included because of Hayes's involvement defending enslaved individuals while he was a lawyer in Cincinnati. So early in his life, Hayes was, like his uncle Sardis, an anti-abolitionist, and due in part to Lucy's influence, he came to feel a moral obligation in defending runaway slaves, or these freedom-seeking people coming across the Ohio River from Kentucky in search of liberty. So the Civil War bolstered Hayes's abhorrence of what was then called the peculiar institution. And very early in the conflict, Hayes laid out his position on the slavery question, writing in his diary, December 22nd, 1861, "We are at the same high call here today, freedom, freedom for all. We all know that it is the essence of this contest." And he would later write during the years of the conflict that slavery is getting death blows. As an institution, it perishes in this war. While advancing his legal career in Cincinnati, Hayes gradually immersed himself in local and national politics. By 1858, he had become strongly associated with the Republican cause in Cincinnati. In December of that same year, a divided city council elected Hayes by a margin of just 1 vote to fill the vacancy of city solicitor. He would go on to win his own election in April 1859 and serve 2 years. In April 1861, with the news of the firing of Fort Sumter, Hayes, then 38, but with Lucy's encouragement, joined the war effort in June of that year, becoming a major in the newly formed 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Promotion to the rank of lieutenant colonel on October 24th, 1861, placed Hayes second in command of the 23rd, and 2 years later, he achieved the rank of brigadier general for gallantry and distinguished service. Hayes and the 23rd operated for most of the war in the rugged mountain terrain of Western Virginia. Notice I didn't say West Virginia, which would not become a state until December 1863. In September 1862, during the Antietam campaign, Hayes played an important role in the Union victory at South Mountain, but during the action he was shot in his left arm above the elbow. In total, he was wounded 5 times in battle and had 4 horses shot out from under him, more war wounds suffered than by any president in U.S. history. Lucy, for her part, spent over 200 days in the camps, tending to the soldiers, nursing them, repairing their uniforms, and providing moral support. They adored Lucy and considered her the mother of the regiment. And a final promotion for Hayes to Brevet Major General came on March 13th, 1865. Although he never participated in battle as general, he gained distinction and the confidence of his men as one of the good colonels and regimental commanders. Hayes believed his rank of general was the most important he ever received, even higher than president, and preferred to be addressed as General Hayes even after the presidency, interestingly. In October of 1864, Hayes, while he was still in the war, was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He would not leave the war, declaring in an August 24th, 1864 letter upon learning of his nomination that, as he said, quote, "an officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped," end quote. Eventually, he took his seat after the war ended, and shortly after he had been reelected to a second term, Congressman Hayes admitted to his uncle that he was not suited for the life of a legislator in Washington. Hayes really rarely attended any of the social functions at the nation's capital. Acceptance of the Republican candidacy for the office of governor of Ohio in June of 1867 offered Hayes a credible excuse for an exit from Congress. To secure the passage of a state constitutional amendment guaranteeing black men the right to vote, Ohio Republicans needed a strong candidate for governor. Unimpeachable character and morals, a distinguished war record, and the fact that he was not too closely identified with the radical Republicans made Hayes an ideal candidate. In the ensuing election, he defeated a formidable Democratic candidate, Allen G. Thurman, by less than 3,000 votes. So it was a very close election. At the same time, Ohio voters rejected the state amendment guaranteeing black male suffrage by 38,000 votes. To be sure, the governorship of Ohio was not the most sought-after position for an ambitious office seeker on the make in the state. It had more of a ceremonial than political power than the governor really, he had no power to veto. He couldn't make any decisions regarding the state budget. Constitutionally, his largest role was really to prepare and transmit an annual message to the Ohio State Legislature, which was sort of like a State of the State address. It was really the lack of any patronage power and budgetary clout that made the governorship undesirable to figures such as, say, James A. Garfield, who preferred serving in Congress. Also, the governor's salary was fairly small for the day, about $4,000 annually, or about $84,000 today. And there was no governor's mansion, meaning that Ohio's chief executive often found himself in his state's salary inadequate to meet the expenses. So why did Hayes accept? Well, essentially because he had become increasingly disillusioned with congressional work, and he really missed Ohio and his family. You got to remember, he was away at the Civil War for all those years. After holding elective office for more than 7 years, Governor Hayes yearned to retire from public life. He refused to run for a third term and declined an offer from a group of insurgent Republicans in January 1872 to contest the Senate seat held by John Sherman, who would later become Secretary of the Treasury under Hayes. Assuming he was finished with public office, Hayes moved his family to Spiegel Grove in May of 1873 and enjoyed the leisurely life of a country squire. However, Republican reverses in 1873 and 1874 cut his retirement short, and he yielded to his party's call, accepting the Republican nomination for governor in June of 1875, subsequently defeating the incumbent William Allen to become Ohio's first 3-term governor. Political victory in 1875 brought Hayes national attention as a possible presidential candidate in 1876. At the Republican National Convention held that year in Cincinnati, Governor Hayes was one of 9 candidates vying for the top spot on that ticket. He was eventually selected, and here William A. Wheeler of New York, a congressman, was the party's choice for vice president. The presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden was one of the most contested in U.S. history. Though Tilden won the popular vote by over 250,000, Hayes ultimately won the Electoral College count 185 to 184, claiming the disputed votes in Florida, Louisiana, Oregon, and South Carolina. It would take 4 months and the creation of a special electoral commission to resolve the situation. During this time, claims of fraud, violence, intimidation by the Democrats against African Americans and Southern Republicans, as well as returning board fraud perpetrated by the Republican Party, all of which were true, was rampant and investigated thoroughly by both parties. I want to fast forward now to nearly the end of the crisis and talk for a moment about the notorious meeting at the Wormley Hotel. A stubborn myth has implied that Rutherford Hayes and his Republican associates made a deal with Democrats at the Wormley for the presidency. This is what they call the so-called Compromise of 1877, trading the rights of African Americans and ending Reconstruction by removing federal troops from the South. Though a meeting did take place between representatives of the two parties, what was discussed had little to no impact on the outcome of the election, which the Electoral Commission would decide only a day later in Hayes's favor. The discussion at the Wormley Hotel focused on assurances Hayes made during his campaign speech before the election concerning his pledge to work the return of the 3 remaining state governments to the South that are still controlled by this since the Civil War by Republicans under military protection to the states themselves as per the Constitution. So returning these states to home rule. What the South hoped for even more than a Tilden presidency was home rule. The Republicans wanted assurances that the rights of African Americans in the southern states would be protected. In April 1877, Hayes would indeed remove the troops protecting the state houses in Louisiana and South Carolina, allowing the Democratic governments to assume control. But he pulled them back to their barracks, not out of the state entirely, as has been misunderstood by the Wormley myth. Historians have noted how the so-called bargain that supposedly took place at the Wormley Hotel was not the shady backroom deal that has been made out to be. Even Edward Burke, one of the Democrats who participated in the Wormley meeting, later called it a bluff session. With the election crisis nearing its end, there was no need for any deal to be struck, and it has been argued that Hayes himself would never have agreed to any bargain, especially as victory was imminent. One aspect we'll never be sure of, however, is how much Hayes, or Tilden for that matter, knew about what was being discussed at the Wormley. One of the Republican representatives stated very clearly later that they themselves had no authority to make any compact on behalf of Hayes. Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of the crisis itself is Hayes's claim that had there been an actual free and fair election in the South without violence and intimidation perpetrated by white Southerners against African Americans and Southern Republicans, Hayes would have easily won both the Republican and, won the popular and electoral vote in 1876. And there's a little slide I want to show you here that shows some of these bulldozed parishes where you see on the left-hand column of those numbers, that's how many Republicans were registered to vote in these Louisiana parishes. And on the right-hand side, you see how many Republicans actually did vote. So there's a huge disparity there. Inauguration Day in the late 19th century took place on March 4th, but in 1877, that day fell on a Sunday. The formal inauguration at the Capitol was therefore scheduled for March 5th, and in order to avoid an interregnum and to eliminate the possibility of the Democrats attempting to install Tilden as president on March 4th, President Grant, at the urging of Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, held a dinner on the evening of March 3rd, after which Supreme Court Justice Morrison R. Waite privately swore Rutherford B. Hayes into office in the Red Room of the White House. Hayes did not altogether approve of this decision, but he acquiesced. Then on March 5th, on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, Hayes was sworn in again as the 19th President of the United States before a crowd of 30,000 spectators, most of whom couldn't hear him because there were no microphones at the time, of course. During his single term as president, 1877 to 1881, Hayes followed his own maxim, "He serves his party best who serves the country best." In advancing the cause of civil service reform and adhering to his campaign promise to serve only a single term in office, Hayes helped to restore people's confidence in the chief of state, which had been so badly damaged by all the scandals of Grant's presidency. Hayes had to contend not only with a hostile and largely Democratic Congress, but sectional and labor issues. The Great Railway Strike and the accompanying riots during the summer of 1877 presented a major test to the new administration. President Hayes had to exert his authority as commander-in-chief of the military by responding to requisitions for federal troops in states where governors were not able to maintain order with state militias. Regarding Southern affairs, Hayes attempted to implement a program based on principles of cooperation and conciliation, as expressly set forth in his nomination acceptance speech and inaugural address that I mentioned earlier. As evidence of his good intentions, in April 1877, he withdrew military support from the two remaining Republican governments in Louisiana and South Carolina. He also appointed several Southern Democrats, such as David M. Key of Tennessee, to important federal positions, and made a well-publicized trip to the Southern states. Key became his postmaster general. Though Hayes regarded all Native Americans as citizens rather than aliens or wards and sought to have them educated, he adhered to Americanization, the policy regarding indigenous peoples that was popular at the time, which sadly stripped away their customs, dress, foodways, religion, and culture. Hayes vetoed the Chinese Exclusion Act when it conflicted with the Burlingame Treaty of 1868 between the United States and China that allowed for Chinese immigration, and helped to settle a boundary dispute between Paraguay and the Triple Alliance of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, essentially establishing the current boundaries of Paraguay, giving them 60% of their current territory. The president also devoted considerable time attempting to solve the nation's economic and monetary problems stemming from the economic panic of 1873. Focusing for a moment on March's theme of music and entertainment, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Madame Marie Salica, a soprano singer, also known as the Queen of Staccato. She toured extensively throughout the United States and twice through Europe, performing for Queen Victoria. She would become the first African-American to perform at the White House. After an introduction by Frederick Douglass, Rutherford and Lucy invited her to entertain them and their guests on November 13, 1878, alongside her husband, Sampson Williams, who was also an opera singer. Another first for the White House included Thomas Edison's visit in April 1878 to demonstrate his new invention, the phonograph. Edison wrote that one night that month, about 11 o'clock, word was received from the president that he would be very pleased if I would come. I was taken there and found Mrs. Hayes and several others waiting. The exhibition continued till about 12:30 a.m. when Mrs. Hayes and several other ladies who had been induced to get up and dress appeared. I left at 3:30 a.m., so they had a great time staying up listening to the phonograph. Called Rutherford the Rover by his detractors for all the traveling he did during his presidency, Hayes made an important Great Western Tour of 1880, which marked the first time a United States president had visited the West Coast while in office. Hayes looked upon the trip as an effective means for promoting unity, dispelling dissension, and restoring harmony in the nation so badly divided by civil war. After his single term, Hayes retired to Spiegel Grove. Dedicated to serving the public as a private citizen and philanthropist, Hayes served as trustee of the Ohio State University and other schools. As a promoter of African-American education, Hayes served as trustee and chairman of the executive committee of the Peabody Education Fund and as the first president of the John F. Slater Fund. In June of 1889, Lucy suffered a stroke at Spiegel Grove and died 3 days later. Though he was devastated by the loss, he remained active with his post-presidency philanthropic work until early January 1893, when he suffered a heart attack at a Cleveland train station. When his son Webb, who was with him at the time, asked if he would like to go back to the house where they had been staying and received some medical care, Rutherford said, "I'd rather die at Spiegel Grove than live anywhere else." He died in Fremont on January 17th in the same bed that he and Lucy shared for nearly 4 years. And just want to take a moment to talk about this bed here. This is Rutherford and Lucy's bedroom at Spiegel Grove. And what's really interesting is that almost every object that you're seeing in this room was in it at the time the president died. His family had the foresight to go around and mark all these objects, so we know what was in the room when he died. And the bed itself was given to Rutherford and Lucy as a wedding present by Maria Webb, that was actually Lucy's grandmother's. And so it's their early wedding bed, it's their bed throughout different periods of their life, and it's their deathbed. So it's like their whole marriage is kind of full circle in this one object. So it's a really interesting piece. And yes, it is very narrow, very small. Rutherford was laid to rest beside Lucy at Fremont's Oakwood Cemetery. President-elect Grover Cleveland, Governor William McKinley, and the entire Ohio State Legislative Assembly attended the funeral ceremonies. In April 18, I'm sorry, I should back up here and talk about this. In April 1915, the remains of the former president and first lady were exhumed and moved to a knoll at Spiegel Grove. That's what we're seeing here. And the site is marked by a granite monument designed by President Hayes in 1889 and quarried from the ancestral farm in Dummerston, Vermont. So this actually comes from Vermont here. So how do we measure Hayes? Washington Gladden's quote from his eulogy on President Hayes perhaps best sums up the man. Grant and Sherman and Sheridan were greater generals. Garfield was a greater genius, and there have been greater orators and greater jurists and greater educators. But take him all in all, for an all-around man, citizen, soldier, statesman, scholar, man of books, man of brains, man of affairs, husband, father, philanthropist, neighbor, friend, there is not another who will measure quite as large as the good man who has just gone. Thank you, everyone. I will go ahead and stop share here in just a second.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Josh. That was terrific. And actually, because I am the executive director of Hayes Presidential, I know some things about Hayes, but every time I hear you talk, I learn something new. And I saw some pictures that I had not seen before too. So thank you for that. So at this time, we're going to transfer over to Alan, who will be speaking about James A. Garfield. And we have had some technical difficulties, so hopefully all goes smoothly here. But Alan, we'll go ahead and let you start sharing your slides and keep our fingers crossed that the tech gods are with us. So a native of Maryland, Alan Gephhardt has been a park ranger with the National Park Service for 19 years, 17 of them at James A. Garfield National Historic Site. His interest in the American presidents dates to childhood. In addition to giving tours on a daily basis, Ranger Allen produces a monthly 2-page newsletter for the site, develops talks, and does research at the Library of Congress in the papers of the president, his wife, and his children. In the summer of 2025, he presented a talk on James Garfield's 1880 front porch campaign for the Warren G. Harding presidential sites, which is always nice. We presidential centers and sites don't get a chance to work together often enough. So it's nice when we have opportunities like that and opportunities like we do have here this evening. So Alan, I will turn things over to you.
James A. Garfield, A Full Life. In the April 1884 issue of Century Magazine, an article appeared on the history of the White House. Its author was E.B. Smalley, a well-known journalist of the day. Writing about the 20th president, he said, "I fear coming generations will see nothing in the stern, sad face of Garfield to remind them that here was a man who loved to play croquet and romp with his boys upon his lawn at Mentor, who read Tennyson and Longfellow at 50 with as much enthusiastic pleasure as at 20, who walked at evening with his arm around the neck of a friend in affectionate conversation, and whose sweet, sunny, loving nature not even 20 years of political strife could warp. Could a better, more generous introduction to a remarkable human being has been written. Although in recent years James Garfield has been somewhat rescued from the oblivion which he has endured for many decades, the truth is he remains a forgotten figure in American history. In his day, James Garfield's life supplied inspiration to countless Americans. He was born in Orange, Ohio, on November 19, 1831, the last of 5 children. His parents were Abram and Eliza Ballou Garfield. When the future president was only 1.5 years old, his father died of pneumonia after fighting a fire near the family home. Little James was a bright boy. He was an outgoing boy. He was reading by the age of 3. But poor and fatherless, he was made the sport of boys that had fathers. His adolescence was typically moody and cheerful by turns. He picked fights with other boys. He was devoted to his mother and his siblings. He loved to read. Next slide. At 16, he began a diary. He wrote about classes he was taking, English, Latin, Greek, mathematics, and the work he was doing to pay for his lessons. He was a carpenter, a janitor, a maker of lye. For 6 weeks in the summer of 1848, he worked on the Ohio and Erie Canal, and while on it, contracted what was likely malaria. This misfortune sent him home to his mother. Over several months, she nursed him back to health and persuaded her adventurous son to give up the canal and go to school. Over the next several years, he attended several schools. First, the Geauga Seminary in Chesterland, Ohio, then the newly formed Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram, and then Williams College in Massachusetts. Graduating from Williams in 1856, second in his class, he returned to Ohio and the Institute to teach Latin and Greek. A year later, he was the principal of the school, which is known today as Hiram College. James Garfield discovered early in life that he liked to orate. As a boy, he went into a field on the family farm and preached to the trees from his pulpit rock. It's still there at the birthplace. When he was 19, he joined the Disciples of Christ and was soon a lay preacher for the church. While at Hiram and Williams, he was a member of debating clubs. He prepared himself well for debate and relished the challenge of defending his point of view in public forums. In 1858, he debated a then well-known Englishman, John Denton, on the topic of evolution. Writing about the debate, Garfield observed that religion must be harmonized with the evidences of the natural sciences, and that science is the literature of God written on the stars, the trees, the rocks. The 6-day debate in Chagrin Falls got people talking. The newly formed Republican Party asked him to run for the state Senate in 1859. He agreed and was elected, taking office in January 1860. Garfield remained in the state Senate until August 1861, when, as a newly appointed lieutenant colonel, he raised a regiment of infantry known as the 42nd Ohio Volunteers. He fought with the 42nd during the first year of his service in the war. Garfield defeated Confederate General Humphrey Marshall at the Battle of Middle Creek in January of 1862, driving the Confederates out of eastern Kentucky and helping to hold Kentucky into the Union. This victory was reported nationwide and gained Garfield a measure of acclaim. Thereafter, he was promoted to brigadier general. Slide 3. Garfield was present at Shiloh and Corinth in 1862. Also in 1862, James Garfield was elected to the 38th Congress. At the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863, James Garfield risked his life riding through enemy lines to communicate useful information to a division of Union troops. That ride earned Garfield the rank of Major General. For the rest of his life, he was known as General Garfield. Now there came a time of decision. Should he stay in the Army or go to Congress? In a letter dated December 12, 1863, Garfield revealed his choice. I have resigned my place in the Army and have taken my seat in Congress. I did this with regret, for I had hoped not to leave the field till every insurgent state had returned to its allegiance. But the President Lincoln, told me he dared not risk a single vote in the House, and he needed some men in Congress who were practically acquainted with the wants of the Army. I did not feel it right to consult my own preference in such a case. Should the war continue, I may return to the Army in the spring. In the last months of 1863, James Garfield had played a momentous role in battle. His first child, Eliza Arabella, had died, and his second child, Harry, had been born. Next slide. Fate has decreed, however, that James Garfield's major contributions to the development of the United States occurred not when he was president, but when he was a congressman, a member of the House of Representatives. He was elected to the House 9 times and served 17 years. He chaired several committees during that time, including the Military Affairs Committee, the Banking Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. He oversaw the creation of the first Department of Education, the U.S. Geological Survey, and what became the model for the 1880 census. He was an advocate of education for white and black, male and female, native-born and immigrant throughout his time in the House of Representatives. He believed that formerly enslaved people must be raised up, not only for their own welfare, which was just, but also for the welfare of the country. He believed gold should be the standard, the basis for American money, and he favored a moderate tariff. On civil service reform, he believed that President Hayes's approach, while noble, was also unrealistic in part. Garfield thought that federal employees should have terms of 4 years in their jobs, and he didn't seem to object to asking federal employees to contribute voluntarily to political campaigns. The issue of Chinese immigration involved diplomacy, class, and economics. Garfield believed that the United States had to honor its treaty obligations with the Chinese, which up to 1880 meant no restriction on Chinese immigration. At the same time, he viewed most Chinese immigrants as being of a servile class, the presence of whom was not good for the United States economically or socially. Chinese servility and parallel in black slavery. Next slide. These were some of the political concerns of Congressman Garfield. But what of the person, James Garfield? Biographer Margaret Beach wrote that he early recognized that a politician needed more than politics to keep his mind alive. Politics alone could fossilize a mind. Garfield counted the day lost and had not contributed to the widening of his intellectual horizons. Reading offered him the best means to that end. Garfield read widely American and European history and biography, ancient and modern literature, geology and geography, poetry, religion, philosophy, economics, and political theory. He loved Shakespeare. He reveled in the poetry of Tennyson and Longfellow. He kept up with medical topics and mathematics. In 1876, the centennial year, he developed a proof for the Pythagorean theory, which was published in the New England Journal of Education. Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Sir Walter Scott, and James Fenimore Cooper were among his favorite authors. He was familiar with Poe and Twain. Next slide. James Garfield was a family man. He was married to Lucretia Rudolph on November 11, 1858. In the words of the late historian Alan Peskin, she was a sober, serious, darkly beautiful girl who conveyed at first an impression of aloofness. Her sincerity, dignity, and quiet charm usually impressed those who knew her well. The courtship and marriage were not without difficulties, but the couple ultimately built a strong, loving, and respectful commitment. It was a successful marriage that produced 7 children, 5 of whom lived to adulthood. With that family, Garfield saw productions of Shakespeare and Gilbert and Sullivan. He played cards, billiards, and croquet with his children. They hiked together and examined maps together excitedly. And James Garfield loved baseball. Wanting his family close at hand during his time in Washington, in 1869, he had a home built at 13th and I Streets Northwest. Desiring a new home in Ohio, in 1876, he purchased a 158-acre farm here in Mentor in Lake County. In the last weeks of the 1880 presidential campaign, from the front porch of his home, Republican James Garfield spoke to groups of farmers, businessmen, college students, and Civil War veterans, black as well as white. This was a new twist in an otherwise tepid presidential cycle. He said nothing momentous, nothing controversial. His remarks were welcoming, philosophical, and brief. There was no discussion of the issues of the day, and he did not attack his Democratic opponent, General Winfield Scott Hancock, a Union general like himself. Might add, offhandedly now, this is the only time in American history when 2 generals faced off for the presidency at the same time. Visitors walked away happy to have heard him, happy to have shaken his hand in the hands of family members. Next slide. James Garfield was narrowly elected on November 2nd, 1880. He was inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1881. President Hayes, his predecessor, was heard to exclaim that he was out of the scrape. James Garfield did not serve long as president, just 6.5 months. During that time, however, he initiated measures to save the government money by calling in 6% bonds exchanging them for 3.5% bonds. To begin revitalizing the U.S. Navy by building it of steel. To pursue to trial, a long-standing fraud case known as the Star Route Scandal, and to initiate increased trade with Latin America. What steps he might have taken on congressional legislation regarding civil service reform remains open to question. President James A. Garfield was assassinated at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington on July 2, 1881. He died 79 days later on September 19th. He was 49 years old. James Garfield and music. This is one of two themes I was asked to address this evening. In James Garfield's diaries, kept from 1848 to 1881, there are mentions here and there about music. When he was a student at the Gephhardt Seminary, he mentioned attending a music school in the evening. It was in fact a glee club. On at least 2 occasions, while he was in the Union Army, he mentioned bands. "I have a fine brass band and a good field band," he wrote to his friend Harry Rhodes in October 1861. In 1862, he wrote that 2 Ohio bands had just been before my tent serenading me. Though in no way a trained musician, he composed a little tune to the words of Alfred Lord Tennyson's "Ring Out the Wild Bells." The singing of this verse by himself became a tradition in the Garfield family at Christmas time for many, many years. The Centennial Exhibition opened in Philadelphia on May 10, 1876. Congressman Garfield and his family were there for the festivities. Among the many aspects of the opening ceremony, Garfield noted a moment of musical pleasure. "I was impressed by the grandeur of the human voice when the 1,000 trained singers rendered in solemn and beautiful music Whittier's Centennial Hymn." In 1880, during the presidential campaign, the Republican nominee was serenaded by the 5th Jubilee Singers, an all-black singing group, twice. The first time occurred when he was returning from a political meeting in New York. There, on August 8th, he was waited on by the 5th Jubilee Singers, and I listened to several of their very beautiful songs. On September 30th, 8 members of the 5th Jubilee Singers, having performed the evening before in Painesville, just east of Mentor, stopped at the farm. They were admitted to the parlor, where they again performed. James Garfield wrote in his diary, "At 9:30, the 5th Jubilee Singers of Fisk University came to Painesville. We gave them a cup of coffee and some fruit. They sang some of their finest pieces." I'd like to conclude this discussion of music with an anecdote from the day of President Garfield's assassination. One version of the story was told by Candace Millard in her book, Destiny of the Republic. On the morning of July 2nd, Harry and Jim Garfield, his older sons, were still in bed when their father bounded into their room, a broad smile on his handsome face, singing "I Mixed These Babies Up" from his favorite song in the new Gilbert and Sullivan opera HMS Pinafore. He plucked his teenage sons out of bed, tucked one under each arm, and swung them around, as if we were in fact 2 babies, his son Jim later recalled. Music was in the mind and on the lips of James Garfield a short time before tragedy befell him. Last slide. For the theme of James Garfield and patriotism, I have selected 2 passages from 2 speeches he delivered during his congressional service. In a speech on Samuel Adams on December 19, 1876, Garfield acknowledged the destructiveness of war. Even so, there was something glorious in the War of the Revolution. He said, "It must not be forgotten that almost at the same time while Samuel Adams was writing the great argument of liberty in Boston, Patrick Henry was formulating the same doctrines in Virginia. But the most remarkable of all is the fact that throughout all that period, filled as it was with the revolutionary spirit, amidst all the passions of war waged against a perfidious enemy, our fathers exhibited so wonderful a restraint, so great a care to observe the forms of law, to protect the rights of the minority, to preserve all those great rights from the common law, so that when they achieved their independence, they were still a law-abiding nation. On February 12, 1878, Congressman Garfield gave a speech in the House accepting the gift of a painting, the signing of the preliminary signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by Francis Carpenter, identifying Abraham Lincoln as the leader who guided the divided nation to a renewed union of the states. Garfield spoke these words about Lincoln. Gifted with an insight and a foresight which the ancients would have called divination, he saw, in the midst of darkness and obscurity, the logic of events and forecast the result. From the first, in his own quaint, original way, without ostentation or offense to his associates, he was pilot and commander of his administration. He was one of the few great rulers whose wisdom increased with his power, and whose spirit grew gentler and tenderer as his triumphs were multiplied. One paper, above all others, filled this spirit with the majesty of its truth. It was the Declaration of Independence. The author and the signers of that instrument became, in his early youth, the heroes of his political worship. Long before his fame had become national, deep and strong was his devotion to liberty. Yet deeper and stronger was his devotion to the Union. For he believed that without union, permanent liberty for either race on this continent would be impossible. Abraham Lincoln's words speak for themselves. James Garfield's invocation of them put him in the company of the founders and of Lincoln and their devotion to the American ideals of liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Alan. I don't see any other questions in the chat. There are a number of comments, though. Again, we thank Josh and Alan for being our speakers this evening. Thanks to all of you who attended tonight and hung in there with us through the technical difficulties. So we are coming up on our time, 8:30. So I will start to bring things to a close here. I am going to put Alan and Josh's contact information. These are their work emails in the chat. I think Alan's had already been shared. So if, as you're mulling all this over, if you have more questions, or if I happen to miss your question in the chat, please feel free to reach out to Alan and Josh and ask those questions. They would be happy to get you information. So again, I want to thank our partners on this program. I want to thank Chris and Lacey, who joined us tonight from the Ohio 250th Commission. And just a reminder that we have 2 more programs remaining in the series. The next one will be on Benjamin Harrison and Warren G. Harding. That is next Wednesday, March 18th, 1 week from tonight, same time, 7 to 8:30. Our speakers next week will be Jennifer Capps, who is the Vice President of Curatorship and Exhibition at the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site in Indianapolis, and also Sherry Hall, who's the retired site manager of the Harding Presidential Sites in Marion. And then our concluding program will be March 25th, again, same time, 7 to 8:30 Eastern Time. And we will conclude with information about Presidents William McKinley and William Howard Taft. Our speakers will be Kim Kenny, Executive Director of the McKinley Presidential Library and Museum in Canton, and Ruth Horstman, who is the Education Technician at the William Howard Taft National Historic Site in Cincinnati. So again, thank you all for being with us this evening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Good night, everyone.